2 minutes, just coming out. Coming in, we had more this morning, so that's good. Here's Tony.
Excellent.
Who's Tony?
I'm sorry, you want to do it, Tony?
Oh, it's in the press release. It's going to be, it should be a question. Craig, or you can draw attention to the fact it's one of the extra things.
Hi, Tony. I did, because, in fact, Rachel phoned with my phone. And
could you please be here for this because of the
yeah, dear.
But
I've got to go before. Oh yeah, so I've got to speak at 1:30.
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
Okay. Good. And so you can handle.
Yes, of course you can.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tony.
Yep.
Are we ready? Or just... Oh,
yeah, there's that. Yeah, it will come up.
Thank you for that.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the launch of the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species update. My name is Jane Smart. I'm Director of the Global Species Programme for IUCN. On my right, we have Simon Stuart, who is the Chair of the Species Survival Commission. On my left, I have Craig Hilton Taylor, who is Head of the Red List Unit based in the UK. And we all work together on putting together the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. So as many of you are aware, I am sure, the IUCN Red List is the global gold standard and the world's most comprehensive information source on the status of animal, plant, and fungi species. What it does is it assesses the risk of extinction of species. So if at any point you read anywhere or you hear about a piece about a species which is endangered, very often if you dig behind that, you will find that IUCN, whether through its members or its commissions or its secretariat, was involved at some point or another. Now, it has many, many uses that we can come to if you're particularly interested in learning more about those. We know, of course, that often we have to impart bad news with every release of the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, but in a sense, we also regard it as the starting point for conservation action. And again, if you hear about or you read about or you see conservation action in action, then you can bet that very often that is triggered by the IUCN Red List. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to introduce Simon Stuart again to speak a little bit more in detail about how the Red List actually works. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. You can hear me? Yes. Okay. As just said, my name is Simon Stuart. I chair the Species Survival Commission, which is one of the 6 commissions of IUCN. IUCN, as you know, is organizing this World Parks Congress. In the Species Survival Commission, we have about 9,500 members now. And these are the experts from nearly every country in the world that provide the information and the expertise to help IUCN and the broader conservation community do what it needs to do to avert extinctions. And one of the main tools we use is of course, the Red List, because IUCN has a mandate from the world's governments and from civil society to produce this objective, independent list of species and all the information needed to help conserve them. They are. Craig will tell you in a minute exactly how many species are on the Red List. Before the last update, or today's update, it was about 75,000. It's a massive amount of work goes into this. It's coordinated by the Secretariat of IUCN in Cambridge. As I say, there are thousands of expert scientists around the world in the Species Survival Commission. And then we have partner organizations such as BirdLife International, NatureServe, Conservation International, and some academic institutions such as the University of Rome or Texas A&M University that are major participants in making the Red List happen. It is a peer-reviewed document. We don't get to control how species get listed. It's done by scientific peer review based on what the data say. Now, the Red List is particularly important at the moment because this is the 50th anniversary of the IUCN Red List. It was started in 1964 by a group of visionaries from around the world in the Species Survival Commission, which was much smaller in those days. And they simply had the idea of recording the status of species, and they came up with categories of threat in a very simple way. And this information was all recorded on card indexes, very few of which in ring-bound folders, very few of which still exist, but there are some in Craig's office in Cambridge. And this, of course, was how the world operated in those days. And the idea was, as information got updated in a species, you'd pull out the old updated sheet for the outdated sheet for a species, you'd toss it away, and you'd replace it with a new one. And that's how it was in those days. Now, of course, that's all completely changed. And those founding fathers of the Red List, the people who realized that the world needed to have objective information on the status of the species, I think would not be able to even imagine what has happened in the years since. So then they were dealing with a few hundred high-profile charismatic species. Now they're getting towards 80,000, is it, Craig, on the Red List that have been assessed. The information is available on the internet, so thousands of people look at that each day. When more people look at online each day than was ever possible to look at those old card index books or anything like that. And the way in which the Red List has been used has changed totally. So in the back in those days, that the information was used solely to find out what to do with threatened species. How do we conserve the Javan rhino or an earwig on the island of St. Helena or hairy-nosed wombat in Australia or anything like that? It was very much focused on single species conservation, and that is still the case, of course, but is now used in a myriad of other ways because there's so much data in the Red List. There's enough data to figure out how different countries are doing in terms of their numbers of threatened species. So, for example, the Global Environment Facility, which I think is still the world's largest funder for conservation in the world, uses the Red List and some other data sets, but the Red List is very important to help determine how much money each country should get from its fund. The Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the big international treaty for conservation in the world, they use the Red List as one of the main data sources to find out how well are the governments doing in achieving their conservation targets. Are the governments moving to achieve their target to basically stop extinctions by 2020? That's what the world's governments, including the Australian government, have committed to. Are they making good progress in that direction? The Red List is used in those sorts of ways. So, and then there are many other ways it's used in a much broader sense beyond single species conservation as well. So it's very interesting that the vision of the founding fathers, as it were, coupled with the huge power of new technology to get information, make it go global, has changed the way in which the red list has been used and made able to use it in a much more powerful way. The final thing I'd like to say is that we're in the World Parks Congress, and this whole week-long series of extremely interesting meetings is about protected areas. And so there's been much discussion in this Congress about how protected areas are used for the conserving of species. There have been all sorts of studies we've been listening to this morning to marshal the evidence to show that species do better in protected areas than outside protected areas, and what are the factors that generate that. We've got, as Craig will tell you, I think in a minute, we've got one species of frog from Colombia that has gone down to a less threatened category because of the establishment of a protected area. So although globally we're still seeing species move to worse states, we're also seeing some positive moves as well. So that's just an overview of how the system works, very roughly, and what it's used for. And I'll hand back to Jane, and who'll take us to our next speaker.
Thanks. Yes, just before I hand over to Craig, I just want to add in relationship to this whole link to protected areas, we need well-managed protected areas if the protected areas are to do their job and conserve species. And what's emerging is only 25% are effectively managed. So that's quite serious. And very often protected areas don't hold enough of the populations of species to ensure their long-term survival. So these are the sort of key issues which link to species conservation and protected areas. But Craig will now talk about the detail of what our findings are today.
Thank you, Jane. Good afternoon, everybody. This is the third update of the Red List this year. And one thing I want to just clarify, when we do a Red List update, we don't reassess all the status of all the species on the Red List. Only a certain portion of them get reassessed, but we also add in brand new species to the Red List because we are trying to reach a target of 160,000 species on the Red List by 2020, because that number will give us a much better handle of what is happening to biodiversity around the world, across different taxonomic groups and in different biogeographic regions and realms. So with this particular update, we processed about 2,500 assessments. Just under 300 of those were reassessments, and the remainder were essentially new species to the Red List. So we now currently have 76,199 species on the IUCN Red List. The last update earlier in the year was 74,000. So we've, as you say, we've added over 2,000 new species to the Red List. And of those, 22,176 are what we call threatened. They are listed as either vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. So these are the species which have a high to very high to extremely high risk of going extinct in the near future unless we do something about it. And that is the role of the Red List, to draw attention to these species which are in danger of going extinct so that we can inform conservation planning and try and get some actions happening on the ground. With this particular update, we don't have a large charismatic set of species to focus the press release around. So it's very much lots of individual different stories, but these stories have themes running through them. So for example, they focus on the particular threats to the species, so, which link very closely to the discussions happening here at the Congress. So lots of talk about impacts of habitat loss on species, impacts of invasive species on threatened species and in protected areas. Over-exploitation. In fact, that's the sort of headline message in the press release that we start off with, looking at species that are exploited for human food. So one of the species that came in this time was a reassessment, was the Pacific bluefin tuna. When we did the assessment last, a couple of years ago, it was listed as least concern, so that it had a low risk of extinction risk. But our marine team have been gathering data on fishery statistics, and from that better data that's come forward now, we can estimate that the Pacific bluefin tuna has undergone a 33% reduction in its population size over the last 22 years. And that is largely to meet the demands for the sushi and the sashimi markets in Asia. And what is happening is that a number of juvenile fishes are being targeted out by the fishermen because the mature adults are harder to find. And so they're harvesting juveniles, which means that is quite disturbing for the whole population as a whole, because there will be fewer juveniles reaching maturity to reproduce. And this really emphasizes the importance of marine protected areas. We need to have much more of them, and they need to be effectively managed, effectively no-go fish zones, so that these bluefin tuna can have a chance to recover, stocks to replenish, so that fishing can become more sustainable in the long term. A new entry to the red list is the Chinese pufferfish, listed as critically endangered, so immediately it's a warning sign. But if you look at the data behind that, it's had a 99% population reduction in the last few years because of exploitation as a food dish for fugu. So people like to eat this fish, like to chance their lives, because it's an extremely poisonous fish, and only skilled chefs know how to remove the poison sacs. But there's a large market out there for people who want to eat this species. So that is quite an alarming species. That's a new addition to the red list. 22 more about habitat loss. We have some bad news stories. For example, in Peninsular Malaysia, there was a snail. We've now, in fact, come up with a name for this a common name for this snail, the Panching braided snail. It only occurred on one limestone outcrop. Limestone is really important for production of cement. A cement company went in, removed the whole hill. It is now a hole in the ground filled with water. That snail is now extinct. So really sad news around that. Coming more to Australia, looking at New South Wales, in the northern parts of New South Wales, a new entry to the red list was a butterfly, the black grass-start butterfly, listed as vulnerable. It occurs in the coastal ecosystem, which is heavily impacted by habitat loss for development, expansion of housing, factories, and so on. But with housing and factories, you also have lots of invasive species coming in, especially invasive plants. And although the species occurs in a number of national parks in that part of Australia, there's a big problem with invasive plants. And the New South Wales Parks Authority are doing a fantastic job to restore the natural habitats in those areas, remove invasive aliens, and giving this butterfly a chance of future survival. So that is the good news that comes in with that story. Still on the good news side is that we'd like to focus on the good news stories to show that conservation can be effective. And linking back to the park's theme, 50% of the species that came into the red list in this update are in protected areas. So that's great. But we know from the sessions that are happening across the Congress here that management effectiveness is really key to the future survival of those protected areas and the species they contain. And Simon mentioned earlier about a frog species. It has this wonderful name of Endemibates Doris swansoni. Doris swanson is a conservationist based in the US in Washington, D.C. area. This species plus another one, Endemibates tomensis, occur in the Colombian Andes, and they're in a very small reserve claimed for protection of these amphibian species. And thanks to the effective management of that reserve, those species have recovered, and we've been able to downlist them to a less threatened category. So those examples just show that there's a big challenge out there, but with concerted efforts, increasing the protected area network, getting better management of protected areas, we can come up with good solutions in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. Okay, so questions, please. The lady in the front row.
I'm a freelance journalist. I'm wanting to know how Australia rates in the extinction states. I mean, we seem to have the worst record. Sorry, Australia seems to have the worst record for extinctions of any country. Is it still keeping that up, or is it improving in any way?
Craig, I think that's one for you.
Yes, so Australia's not the worst. We still haven't assessed all the species in Australia, so all we can tell is from the groups that we have assessed. So if you look across all species that have been assessed in Australia, about 17% of the assessed species in Australia are listed as threatened. So it's not as bad as some parts of the world, especially smaller island states where the percentage will be much higher, 30-40%. So it still has a challenge that you want to try and get your risk of extinction down as much as possible, but it's not doing as badly as some other countries.
Thanks. And Simon would like to add to that one.
Yes, I would, a few points to make on this. Australia lost a lot of species with the arrival of people on the continent. So there was a wave of extinction of very large-bodied mammals 40, 50,000 years ago. There was a subsequent wave of extinction, 2000, when the thylacine and the Tasmanian devil were lost from the Australian mainland, and more recently there have been big declines and sometimes extinctions averted by focused last-ditch efforts, but the spread of invasive species has been devastating, and especially cats and foxes has been devastating, and there are big declines ongoing at the moment in the Northern Territory and parts, I think, the northern part of Western Australia, and so that is a major concern. We haven't featured that in the current Red List update, but when we update all the Australian mammals, which we will do, I think, next year or at the very latest early in 2016, we've been having some discussions on that soon. It will show some disturbing things from those parts of Australia. There was the sad extinction of the Christmas Island pipistrelle a few years ago, a bat from Christmas Island. So that was a very, very sad thing. Probably invasive species again, and then there's been the loss of some amphibian species due to the disease chytridiomycosis, and the most famous ones were the 2 species of gastric brooding frog that died out. So there have been some sad stories from Australia. In a few weeks' time, in fact next week, I think a few of us are publishing a paper, and I can't give you the results yet, which is going to show how different countries perform on the IUCN Red List Index. And at that point, you'll be able to see the recent trend of how Australia has performed vis-a-vis other countries for, I think it is, Mike, is it mammal, bird and amphibian species in that paper? And you'll be able to compare the performance of Australia, and I can give you my contact details. That's embargoed till next week, that story.
Okay, thank you very much. Other points?
Look, I'm not sure you can comment to this, but given that it is a progress report, is Australia heading in the right direction? I mean, are you allowed to compare Australia with itself? I mean, compared to last time, is it heading in the right direction, or is what you're seeing slightly more alarming?
We don't have enough data to do a comparison at this stage. There are very few Australian species in this update, so yeah. Until we do all the mammals again, then we can see what's really happened with the mammals. And as Simon says, the initial results do look quite disturbing for what's happening in the Northern Territories.
But I'd like to make an additional comment to kind of put this in context. Australia is trying to do the right thing. They have appointed a threatened species commissioner, which is, I think, a good way of drawing attention to the work that needs to be done to conserve species in their habitats. But I would stress the point that, we've had some good news about the percentages of protected areas which are now established. So we've got the just over 15% on the land and just over 3% in the sea. But these must be effectively managed, particularly in the sea. This is going to need some sort of serious management of fisheries. Otherwise, these marine protected areas will simply not work to conserve the species that they're meant to conserve. Simon, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I'm just going to say that almost no country is at the moment heading in the right direction in relation to the target that governments have set themselves to stop extinctions by 2020. There are, from the data sets that we've done on mammals, birds and amphibians, there are a small number of countries that do now have positive trends, but they're very few, and Australia is not one of those countries. So the issue for countries like Australia and most countries is that deterioration increasing in its rate, or is it leveling off so that it can then start to improve? And we will have more data on that because we are updating the mammals and amphibians as we speak, and so we'll have more information on that quite soon, but the trend for Australia is negative.
Well, that wasn't a good sign, was it?
That was from my side.
But just from the perspective of these global targets, also by 2020, Australia and most other countries of the world have promised to bring about the recovery of known threatened species. And here the Red List is particularly relevant because the Red List tells us what we know and which species are threatened. And those are the ones which are meant to have recovery plans in place and being acted upon, so we get the on-the-ground impact. Other questions, please?
So how many new species update on the red list right now?
That's one for Craig.
Sorry, repeat the question.
How many new species update on the red list right now?
How many new species?
Having new species. So exactly there are 2,125.
Thank you. There's a point there.
How about the situation in Europe? How about the situation in Europe overall?
Okay, Craig?
So once again, there wasn't much focus on European species, though there were some European species that came in. We have an EC-funded series of projects looking at the status of different groups across Europe. So there were some pollinators. We're looking at bumblebees across Europe, what's happening to them at the moment, marine fish. So those results are coming in, but we don't have a complete picture yet. That picture will be completed by the end of this year, and there will be a report released at the end of this year with a press conference with the European Commission early in the new year, stating what is happening to a wide range of different species across Europe.
Okay. Other questions, please? Yes, please.
So you identify here some of the major causes of these extinctions in resource exploitation. Does that mean some of the most effective management would be lowering those the taking of those resources, or would you identify different measures of management specifically as being particularly effective?
So the red list, whenever we do a red list assessment, we record the threats and we record the conservation actions necessary to tackle that threat, if you like. And there's a lot of other information in the database. So often, yes, that is the case. So if the threat is known to be invasive species, to deal with the invasive species would be a way of bringing about the recovery of that species. But often you have to look and make sure that other factors are in play and being correctly managed as well. Don't know if my colleagues want to add to that.
By resource exploitation, you meant things like mining away a hill where a snail occurred. Yeah. Well, yes, if you destroy the entire habitat of the species, it's not good news for that species. You have to take, and if you want to know more about that story, by the way, that Tony Whitten might just want to wave his hand here, can maybe add something, or you speak to him afterwards. You need to be somewhere else to speak by 1:30, don't you? But as do I. But that's, I think, an important lesson. But the key thing is different species face different threats. Many species have a combination of threats. To bring about the recovery of species and to prevent extinction, you have to deal with the actual threatening processes. So if it's wildlife trade, then you have to deal with the regulation of wildlife trade. If it's loss of habitat, you have to deal with that. If it's an invasive species out competing that species, then you have to deal with that. One very important thing when it comes to the issue of resource exploitation is environmental impact assessments, and really looking at what the impact of proposed developments are going to be, and from the outset addressing those rather than playing catch up afterwards. The standards at which such assessments are done and the consequences of them after they've been done is variable across the planet. And there's probably a need for them to be those processes to be improved in many places, so we don't have another snail disaster.
But I think we can say in general, we need a lot more of this kind of conservation action where we often do know what you have to do to tackle the threatening processes. It does work on the whole, but we need more of it and we need to scale it up. Yes, please.
How do you monitor for each country to reserve their species?
Monitor the recovery of the species? Yeah, that's a good question. That would be on a kind of country by country or even sort of place by place basis. And that assumes in the first place that for instance, if it's a protected area, the people know that species might be in trouble and that there needs to be something to be done to ameliorate that threat. The Species Survival Commission provides advice on the drawing up of action plans to tackle threatened species. Do you want to say more about that, Simon?
Yes. Well, what I was going to say is it depends what it is you're monitoring. If you're monitoring a single species that people are concerned about in a particular country or group of countries, it's obviously possible to do that population monitoring or monitoring the habitat on a regular basis, and it might be possible to monitor every year or every few years and look at what the trends are and whether that species is improving or recovering. And there are quite a lot of species for which, especially the species is easier to count, birds, large mammals, that sort of thing, or some commercially valuable fish, where it's possible to monitor over time how they're doing. Now, and we use such data in the red list. For the majority of species, it's very hard to do that. And when we're looking at multi-species, like whole blocks of species, like all the world's mammals, how are we doing, or all the world's fish or amphibians, it's very hard to monitor except on quite long time scales, because to monitor thousands of species is a very large amount of work. And so we last monitored all the world's species of mammals, for example, in 2008. We're currently updating. We'd hope to update them all by next year. It'll probably be the year after, just because of the amount of work and the resources we have. So that was an 8-year time period. BirdLife International are able to, with the very large resources of the bird community, monitor all birds and compare all countries every 4 years. So it depends on the type of monitoring, but for large multi-species monitoring, you have reasonably long time sequences and how quickly you can do it. Single species, you can do it much more rapidly.
Can I also add that from wide-ranging species that cross country boundaries, the status of a species may differ from one country to another. So it's very important that countries also do their national red lists and do them on a regular basis so that they know what is actually happening within their own country. So we have the global red list, but also these country-level red lists, which help to inform local conservation planning and monitoring.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
Look, every time you come out with an update, invariably you're adding new species, in this case, thousands. Can you give me a brief summary of the level of concern, the fact that we are adding more species virtually every time?
Well, I think there's a huge level of concern, because even when good work is being done to try and bring about the recovery of species, inevitably it's not enough and not at a large enough scale. But let my colleagues add to that now.
Yes, what I'd say is just need to be a little bit careful on what the figures mean here. So when we add species to the red list, that doesn't necessarily, that in itself isn't necessarily a concern, because when we record the status of a species, we try to record all the information because you don't want to throw away useful information. So a lot of the species, in fact, the great majority of species in the red list are not at elevated risk of extinction. They're in a category we call least concern. It's least concern in terms of their extinction risk. So the key number is the number of threatened species and the percentage of threatened species in relation to the overall number of species that we are looking at. That's the important figure. And so for the threatened species, that's now 22,413. Mm-hmm. Yep, okay. And that number will go up in two ways. One is it will go up because as we finish assessing all the fish, for example, or all the certain plants or fungi or whatever, because we hadn't assessed those species before, inevitably the number goes up. So the fact it went up doesn't mean things got more threatened. It just meant we got to know more. And then the other way it goes up is if the situation of species deteriorates, so that things that we thought were threatened, non-threatened before, now turn out to be threatened because things got worse. And that, of course, we're very worried about. There's huge concern about that. And that is why the world's governments set a surprisingly radical target in 2010 when they met in Japan. And they set these Aichi targets, and Aichi target 12 is the one to stop extinctions by 2020. Now, that is actually a surprisingly radical target. The government of Australia and many other governments are committed, most other governments are committed to achieving that target. And it, I think, is a sign of significant concern. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. But we now need to monitor to see, are we on track to achieve that? And has the level of concern led to the requisite level of action?
Thank you, Simon. Craig, do you want to add?
That's-
No. I mean, the Global Biodiversity Outlook number 4 launched at the 12th meeting of the CBD's Conference of the Parties about 3 weeks ago, showed that we're not on track to achieve this target 12, Aichi target 12 that Simon mentioned. So that data is available.
I just added, early next year, we hope to produce and publish the first trends of what's actually happening for 2 groups of plant species. It's going to be for the cycads and the conifers, right, Mike? And that's going to give us some measures of what's happening, and we'll follow that with in the following year or so with updated bird, amphibian, and mammal information. So we're going to get a better idea of how we're doing to the government's targets and whether we're responding to the concern.
So you raise a good question, because we're now halfway into the UN Decade of Biodiversity, and this target 12, needs a lot more resources behind it if we're to see the kind of promises that the government's made in 2010 in Japan kept, if we seek to see these issues really being tackled.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
With the massive increase in rhino poaching, is the IUCN going to be doing anything specific to try and save sort of key species like rhino, because they seem to be heading for extinction very fast?
Thank you. Thank you, Simon.
Yes. Yes, there's a huge concern about the very heavy poaching of rhino, especially in Kruger National Park along the border with Mozambique. We have an African rhino specialist group. The chair is actually a man called Mike Knight, who's here at this conference, if you want to know more. We in both Africa and Asia, because rhinos in Asia too, we pull together all the experts and work very closely with the governments. So we have developed in Africa a whole system of national rhino action plans with monitorable targets, and they go down to plans at each site. That's all been pulled together in the last 15 years. And every significant rhino population on government land in Africa now has a plan behind it, and that's being monitored. Although this outbreak of rhino poaching is extremely disturbing, actually, until recently, there was actually a recovery phase of African rhinos because of the much improved protection over the recent years. There was a massive decline in African rhinos up until the early 1990s. Disastrous situation that was averted, and there's been significant recovery there. And now we have this terrible outbreak of poaching. In the Asian situation, you've got some recovery going on of rhinos in India and Nepal, but an extremely concerning situation in Indonesia with the Javan and Sumatran rhinos that have tiny populations left. And so IUCN pulled together with the government of Indonesia the key Asian countries last year, and we produced what's called the Banda Lampung Declaration, which is a whole set of declarations now by the governments of how they're going to prevent the extinctions of rhinos in Asia. And we've been working with a number of NGOs, including WWF and the International Rhino Foundation and several others now to get the resources for Indonesia to implement that plan.
Thanks very much. And of course, it's getting more and more expensive because tackling poaching costs money. Yeah. Any other questions? There's the microphone.
What is the area of the country that have lost more species? Talking about the extinct species.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yes. What is the area of the country that have lost more species?
Of this country or?
No, global.
What is the area?
The country, the area. We talk about extinct species. Extinct.
Yeah.
Yes. The percentage. You have the
percentage of extinct species
in different
countries?
Yeah.
Do we have some?
You have this. That's our.
Craig, do you want to
Yes.
talk about how we deal with that
Yeah.
issue? Yeah.
So if you look on the Red List website, there's a whole series of summary tables which give you numbers of species in different categories by country. And so for extinct, you can see that. And so places like Hawaii will stand out very sharply. And that's not a country, obviously, it's a part of the USA. But Hawaii stands out as with a very high number of extinctions because of the impacts of people in the introduction of various invasive species in Hawaii very early on. So it's hard to compare those numbers because we haven't assessed all species in every single country. So the numbers are constantly changing. What may be high for one country one year will change the next year as we get new assessments in. So you have to always bear that in mind. It's in relation to what has been assessed.
Thank you. Other
Would
questions?
Craig possibly be able to
I can
link
you
to the
Yeah.
actual web
Yeah,
link?
I probably have it here. I could look it up for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions? Nobody's going to ask about koalas? The music of koalas probably up the last few days.
The koala dad. Let be as possible.
There you go.
I'm not on top of that story, I'm afraid. Are you, Craig?
Craig can,
I can't remember. It is in
Craig can talk about-
it is in a threatened category, and I have seen the recent draft assessment, and I can't comment on it at this stage.
So
Something
the,
like 95%, their habitat's got a 95% chance
Chance
of
of-
being destroyed.
yeah.
And I think that
we can quickly check it out for you. Do you want to do koalas?
there was an Australian Mammal Action Plan was produced. When was it, last year, Mike, or the year before?
Yeah.
And so all the Australian mammal assessments are being updated at the moment based on that. In fact, we've even had discussions on that today in the Congress. Sorry?
When will that be finished?
Well, certainly during 2015, it'll be
Yes.
finished, won't it? Sorry?
15, 16.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because the data has to be taken from the Australian Action Plan into the Red List. So the key scientists are working on that at the moment. So yeah, I mean, I'm told 2015. Mike's over there saying 2015, 2016. But, sorry?
Who are the key scientists?
The key scientists.
The person who led the Australian Action Plan was John Wojnarski. And so we can connect you to him if you wish. Yeah, okay.
Just what is the feeling on koalas, seeing as
Now my colleagues are going to kill me for mentioning that.
I don't follow.
Craig and then Mike. We're going to ask Mike to add.
So with the last assessment of all the mammals in 2008, we listed the koala as least concern. There were a number of interest groups that expressed their concern about the listing, and that information has been passed back to the specialist group. They are obviously considering it as part of the action plan for Australasian marsupials, and we'll see what the new listing comes out as. I don't know at this stage. I haven't seen a draft of it.
But I think we can say that the original range is much decreased. There are lots of introduction schemes to part of its original range. It does face habitat destruction. And obviously it's an Australian icon, as we've seen over the last couple of days. Mike, do you want to add anything?
But I'll add one thing in terms of what the Red List tells you. So the Red List is looking at species from the perspective of their extinction risk. That's what it's doing. So that's how it's categorizing them. So a lot of species might be of conservation concern for all sorts of reasons, because they're disappearing from places where people are very familiar with them, people are fond of them, they have high economic value. There are various reasons why we're concerned about species. Extinction risk is one of those things. There are many mammals in Australia that are clearly have much higher extinction risk than the koala. So if something's listed as least concern in the Red List, that means that we don't think it's going to go extinct. Doesn't mean it's not important for conservation. It could be very important.
And it also doesn't mean that you don't keep an eye on it, to use a double negative. It needs to be kept an eye on. And actually, I mean, just reflecting on the pictures in the press over the weekend, you can see in the eyes of these world leaders just how lovely they think these things are. You know, and working in from the species conservation perspective, we wish that translated a little bit more to some serious cash to do something about these species when the information from the IUCN Red List shows that so many things are in trouble all over the world. I mean, that's how we regard the red list. It's a wake-up call. It's a wake-up for action. And actually, in many ways, if a species finds itself in a threatened category on the red list, it's a good thing because it does draw attention to to action that needs to be carried out. But within this least concern category that Simon mentioned, there's a lot going on. So when we see something slip from least concern to near threatened and then towards the threatened categories, then we say let's keep an eye on that, because actually carrying out the conservation action is going to be a lot cheaper and a lot easier than if it slides towards critically endangered, for instance, when the work gets a lot more expensive in a sense and a lot more difficult. Just because there are so fewer individuals in general, then the conservation action gets harder to carry out in a way. So that's how it all works. But we want more. And actually, the other irony about all this is that, and I always have to be very careful about how I say this. Craig knows what I'm going to say because he's looking at me thinking, what's she going to say? I bet she's going to say it. But actually, we need more resources to carry out more work, to find out what is going on to species all over the world. Assessing a species in the scientifically underpinned way that we do this is resource intensive. It's not nearly as resource intensive as many other things in society. But it costs money, and we're very grateful that we have 9,000 experts in the Species Survival Commission helping us with their knowledge, but still we have to get them to workshops, we have to find ways of covering their time. So this is a huge operation that the world is leaning very heavily on as a kind of information and a knowledge product. Any more questions?
Does an earwig count as much in your estimation as a rhino? In other words, in terms of IUCN.
That's an excellent question. Who wants to have a go at this?
Yeah, I'll have a go at it. So we don't have a, IUCN doesn't, in a sense, probably does treat them all equally, because it's up to all of you to decide the value you place on different species. It's up to societies. It's up to that. So the red list itself treats every species equally. It's all handled in the same way. Obviously, some species are higher profile and more controversial sometimes to assess than others, and so we have to put greater effort, especially when there are a lot of experts, to get the assessment all right. But in principle, all species are equal. I think obviously, in terms of the public perceptions, not all species are equal, and some are more appreciated than others. I think that is clear, and that also differs between cultures and societies. And then other species are not equal in the sense to which they contribute to the functioning of ecosystems, or have direct economic value. So there are all sorts of things that affect the values of species, but the red list basically treats everything as equal.
Great.
If I can just add, the St. Helena earwig is just symptomatic of what's happening on St. Helena at the moment. And so as a result of that listing, we have experts now looking at other invertebrate species on St. Helena, which has quite a unique fauna, to see what has happened to those species because of introductions of invasive species. So the earwig listing is now spurred on a whole lot of research work, which will give us a much better understanding of what is happening on the island of St. Helena, and hopefully get better conservation actions in place for the whole island, the fauna and the flora.
Thank you, Craig. Any other questions? I'm sure you can grab these guys individually. Actually, I'm going to have to rush. We're good? Yep. Thanks. Thanks very much for coming, everybody. Thank you.